You know, right now, at this very moment, you are caught in an invisible web, and it's literally controlling almost every single aspect of your daily life. I mean, really think about it for a second. Why on earth does a single solitary financial decision made in Washington, D.C. instantly dictate the price of your milk in Uganda, or the cost of your rent in Brazil, or whether your small business in Indonesia actually survives the year? Well, here is the absolute wildest part. This happens even if you have never touched a US dollar in your entire life. Crazy, right? So today, in this explainer, we're ripping the veil off how exactly one single currency silently runs the entire globe, and why a massive, multi-front rebellion is quietly trying to tear the whole system down. Let's get into it. Section 1. The silent global power. So, to really understand why your grocery bill just keeps going up, you've got to look at the core mechanism driving it all, the interest rate. This is controlled by the US Federal Reserve, and it's basically just the percentage of extra money you pay when you borrow. Simple enough, right? But here's the catch. When the US faces inflation, they hike this rate up. Almost instantly, global investors panic, pull their cash out of developing countries, and rush it into the safety of US banks. This triggers a massive global capital flight. Your local currency suddenly tanks, and boom, imported food, medicine, and fuel just skyrocket in price. And this whole domino effect, it builds into an absolute nightmare for developing nations. We call it the dollar debt trap. Okay, imagine a country borrows $1 billion when the exchange rate is, say, $1 to 10 local units. Fast forward 2 years, the dollar gets stronger. Now, $1 equals 20 local units. Without borrowing a single extra cent, that country's debt repayment has literally just doubled out of thin air. So, they inevitably default on their loans, governments are forced to hike up taxes, slash pensions, and everyday, ordinary people just suffer silently. Okay, Section 2. The evolution of money. Let's dive in to how this happened. Seriously, how did a simple piece of green paper get this kind of a chokehold on the globe? Well, honestly, money was born out of sheer frustration. The ancient barter system, like trying to trade milk for rice, was an absolute disaster if the other guy didn't actually want your milk. So way back in 600 BC in Lydia, they minted electrum coins to fix it. Fast forward to 11th century China, and people realized that lugging around massive, heavy bags of metal coins was a really great way to get robbed or, just throw out your back. So the government printed jiaozi, the world's very first paper money. By the 1600s, European goldsmiths started issuing paper receipts for deposited gold. Just like that, paper had officially become wealth. Moving on to Section 3, how the dollar became king. So how did the US dollar manage to leapfrog literally everything else to claim the crown? In short, World War II. While other nations' economies were completely devastated, the US emerged with untouched infrastructure and vaults absolutely bursting with gold. The real turning point, though, happened in 1944 at a place called Bretton Woods. 44 countries got together to figure out how to rebuild the global economy, and they basically agreed to make the US dollar the absolute center of the financial universe. They pegged their own currencies to the dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged directly to gold at exactly $35 an ounce. Instantly, all the big stuff, oil, gold, wheat, was priced strictly in US dollars. But, well, by the 1970s, there was a major problem. The US had printed way too many dollars to fund various wars and domestic programs. They actually didn't have enough gold left in the vaults to back it all up. So in 1971, President Nixon shocked the entire world by severing the tie between the dollar and gold entirely. This massive move shifted the whole world onto what we call fiat money. Today, money has value simply because the government says it does. It is backed by nothing but pure, unadulterated trust. Yet, mostly because the US had the strongest military and the most robust institutions at the time, the dollar somehow stayed right on top. Section 4. Weaponizing the US dollar. Now, having the world's reserve currency isn't just some nice economic perk. It is a profound geopolitical tool, and it all relies on the hidden plumbing of global finance, SWIFT. SWIFT is essentially the global messaging system that allows banks anywhere on Earth to send money across borders instantly. It's kind of like the internet for banking. And since the vast majority of that money moves in dollars, the US obviously has immense influence over this entire network. So, when a major geopolitical conflict arises, the US can place sanctions on a country. The target is simply disconnected from SWIFT. Just like that, they cannot send or receive dollars. Without firing a single physical bullet, an entire nation is financially isolated from the rest of the world. We saw the mechanics of this happen objectively with Iran over its nuclear program, and again with Russia in 2022. The message to the rest of the world was crystal clear. If you cross the dollar, your economy can essentially be turned off overnight. Which brings us to Section 5, the De-Dollarization Rebellion. That kind of immense, unchecked financial power obviously sparked a lot of anxiety globally. It prompted a bunch of countries to ask a very logical question. Why depend on a system that can so easily be used against us? And this rebellion? It's happening right now, on multiple fronts. The BRICS nations, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they're actively exploring a shared currency to bypass the dollar altogether. Saudi Arabia, after 50 years of the exclusive petrodollar system, is now accepting yuan and rupees for its oil. Plus, over 130 countries are testing brand new digital currencies, and decentralized crypto is just exploding everywhere. Let's actually look a bit closer at CBDCs. Now, these are not your standard, highly speculative cryptos. These are official, programmable digital currencies issued directly by central banks. Think Nigeria's e-naira or India's digital rupee. They're a real game changer because they allow, say, a business in Indonesia to buy goods from Brazil instantly, settling the transaction in their own native digital currencies. This completely bypasses SWIFT and ignores the US banking system entirely. And, parallel to all these government moves, everyday people started a rebellion of their own, born right out of the anger of the 2008 financial crisis. When the big banks collapsed and got bailed out, a pseudonymous figure named Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin. It has a strict cap of 21 million coins, it's completely decentralized, no central bank, absolutely no government control, and a fully transparent blockchain that ensures nobody can cheat the system. For a lot of people, it was a first taste of total financial freedom. Now, what's really interesting about all this? Here is the deep irony of the whole shebang. Even in the wild, totally decentralized world of crypto, major stablecoins like USDC are still tightly tied to fiat. And almost all crypto assets out there, they are still priced in, yep, you guessed it, US dollars. The dollar still whispers in the background of the exact rebellion that's trying to escape it. Section 6, the future of currency. We are currently witnessing a quiet but incredibly intense financial war. It's not being fought with guns or tanks, but with code, ledgers, and economic alliances. And look, the dollar has a massive 75-year head start. It is deeply, deeply hardwired into global shipping contracts, international banking, loan structures, and practically every financial app sitting on your phone right now. Dislodging a system that's entrenched that deeply, well, that takes way more than just a slick new piece of technology or a political alliance. Because at the end of the day, money isn't metal. It's not a piece of paper. It's not even blockchain code. It is, simply put, trust. If people don't believe in a currency, no matter how perfectly or beautifully designed it is, it's going to collapse into hyperinflation. That is exactly why people in the middle of severe economic crises still choose to hide physical US dollars under their mattresses. Trust is everything. The future of money is being actively rewritten as we speak. We are rapidly moving toward a multi-currency world where power is shared, where digital wallets cross borders instantly, and where financial independence is the ultimate global goal. The dollar will absolutely remain powerful, for sure, but it's probably no longer going to stand completely alone. So as this new era unfolds and this invisible web shifts all around you, in a multi-currency future, when the dust finally settles, who will you trust?
89.7 sextillion%. That is an 89, followed by 20 zeros. Let's just dive right into this because that astronomical, literally mind-bending number was the actual hyperinflation rate that absolutely destroyed Zimbabwe's economy. I mean, it got so bad, they actually had to issue a $100 trillion single banknote. History is aggressively clear on this one rule. When a country prints massive amounts of money to escape an economic crisis, total collapse always follows.
But here is the ultimate economic paradox that we need to unravel today. In just 1 month, back in April 2020, the United States printed $3 trillion completely out of thin air. They ran the exact same playbook that destroyed Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Germany. Yet the US economy didn't collapse into some hyperinflationary nightmare. In fact, it kept growing. So how on earth is that mathematically possible?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down exactly how America's dollar became an invincible, seemingly logic-defying global force. We're looking at the mechanics of this money machine, how it survives massive debt, and the secret geopolitical weapon that keeps the whole system afloat when, by all historic metrics, it should be in absolute ruins.
Section 1. The Hyperinflation Horror Story.
To really grasp the superpower of the US dollar, we first have to investigate the catastrophic, world-ending consequences of printing money throughout history. Let's look at the baseline rule of economics that the US is somehow defying. Just look at the sheer speed of the collapse in Weimar Germany. After World War I, Germany was forced to pay $33 billion in reparations. They didn't have it, so, they just started printing it. In 1921, one US dollar equaled 70 German marks. Just 3 years later, by the end of 1924, one single dollar was equal to 4.2 trillion marks. The currency was completely annihilated.
And the real-world horror of this was unimaginable. A single loaf of bread suddenly cost 2 billion marks. A pound of butter, 2 trillion marks. The German middle class was practically wiped out overnight. People would get paid in the morning, pack their wages into literal suitcases, and sprint to the shops because prices would double by the afternoon. It got so absurd that people actually burned stacks of cash in their fireplaces simply because the paper money was cheaper than buying actual firewood. And it's not just ancient history either. When Venezuela tried to print their way out of a crisis, they were hit with a devastating 1,000,000% inflation rate. The historical precedent is basically set in stone. Turn on the money printers and you unlock an economic horror story.
Section 2. America's ticking time bomb.
Which brings us to the present day and the exact same crime currently being committed by the United States. On one side, we have Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. They print money, they get total collapse. On the other side, the USA injects $3 trillion into the economy over a couple of years starting in 2020, and somehow they thrive. They get economic growth. But that printing comes with a terrifying price tag. The current United States national debt is sitting at a staggering $36 trillion. To keep this system alive, the US has historically treated its debt ceiling not really as a hard limit, but more like a moving target. They've routinely crossed their borrowing cap 78 times since 1960. Now, to put the sheer mass of this number into perspective, $36 trillion in debt is greater than the combined GDP of India, China, Russia, the UK, and Japan put together. Just servicing the interest payments on this mountain of debt cost the United States $1 trillion. And this isn't just a localized problem for Americans. It's a massive global hazard. The International Monetary Fund issued this chilling, direct warning, stating, "Without exaggeration, American debt is a ticking time clock that will detonate unless we take serious, responsible action." So if the bomb is ticking, how is the US government still functioning so smoothly?
Section 3. The digital money machine.
To figure out how the government functions so smoothly under all this debt, we need to break down the mechanical cheat code the Federal Reserve uses to make trillions of dollars appear completely out of thin air. Here's how the money machine actually works. Step 1. The Federal Reserve doesn't fire up physical printing presses to make paper money anymore. It simply creates billions digitally with a few keystrokes. Step 2. It uses this newly typed up digital money to buy 10-year bonds from commercial banks. Suddenly, these banks are flooded with billions in fresh reserves. Step 3. Because the banks are now swimming in cash, the supply of money is super high, which allows them to drastically lower their interest rates.
And that low interest rate, it kicks the whole economic flywheel into high gear. Developers borrow this cheap money to build homes, hiring plumbers, electricians, and laborers. Consumers get cheap mortgages. They buy those homes and furnish them. As more people work and spend, demand skyrockets. Stock prices go up, property values go up, and crucially for the government, tax revenues go up. The digital money effectively jumpstarts the entire economy. Which brings us right back to our high-stakes question. If you inject trillions of new digital dollars into the system, the value of the dollar should plummet and prices should spiral completely out of control. Why hasn't this triggered the Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe effect? Why is there no hyperinflation?
Section 4. The Global Rescue Mission.
The answer to this paradox is America's geopolitical secret weapon. Whenever the US gets into deep economic trouble and prints money, the rest of the global market essentially steps in to save them. Think of it as the avocado effect. When the US prints massive amounts of money, the dollar naturally depreciates. It goes down in value. But when the dollar weakens, American goods suddenly become much cheaper for the rest of the world to buy. If the dollar drops, avocados priced in dollars become cheaper globally. Countries immediately start importing more of them. Now apply that avocado logic to the most critical resources on the entire planet. Because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, massive global commodities like oil, gold, and wheat are settled almost exclusively in dollars. When the dollar drops in value, the whole world rushes in to buy this newly cheapened oil and gold. But to buy it, they need dollars. So the instant the dollar drops, global demand for the dollar comes roaring right back, completely stabilizing its value.
Section 5. The ultimate safe haven. But you know, it's not just trade that saves the dollar. In a really bizarre twist of global psychology, worldwide panic and chaos actually act as the ultimate strengthener for the American economy. Just look at the last 2 decades. In 2008, we had the massive financial crash. In 2020, a global pandemic brought the world to a standstill. In 2022, the Russia-Ukraine war erupted, sending shockwaves through global energy markets. Every single one of these events triggered immense, terrifying investor panic.
And what happens when the world panics? Investors instantly sell off their risky assets around the globe and run fleeing back to park their capital in what they perceive as the absolute safest asset on planet Earth, the US dollar. Whether it's a debt crisis in Europe or a war in Eastern Europe, billions of dollars flood back into the US market. This massive surge in demand allows the Federal Reserve to quietly raise interest rates, tighten the money supply, and basically cool off any brewing inflation.
Section 6. The trillion-dollar question.
So, the true power of the United States doesn't just lie in its military might or in Silicon Valley tech. It lies in a completely untouchable superpower: unwavering global trust. This is exactly why no other country can just copy this playbook. If Turkey or Venezuela print money, it becomes worthless because no one buys global oil in their currency, and frankly, nobody trusts it. Even if you hold billions of another currency, it's virtually useless on the global stage without that trust. Even China, an absolute economic titan and a potential backup superpower, lacks the deep, systemic global trust that the US dollar commands. Because the world implicitly trusts the dollar, the US can carry $36 trillion in debt and continue to print trillions more without causing their society to collapse.
Which leaves us with the ultimate, chilling question for the 21st century. This whole system works flawlessly, as long as the world buys oil in dollars and as long as investors see it as the ultimate safe haven. But trust is fragile. If the unbreakable trust in the US dollar ever finally fades, and the world decides they need a new backup, what happens to the global world order, and who exactly will step up to be the next superpower?
Okay, so think about the standard classroom map of the United States. You know the one. Now, what if I told you that map is basically a carefully crafted illusion, right? The US didn't just casually stop at the Pacific Ocean. Instead, it built this massive, completely hidden architecture of global military might and economic control. Let's dive into exactly how that happened.
So yeah, that standard map is a lie. We're so used to seeing this neat, contained continental blob, right? With Hawaii and Alaska just tucked safely into those little boxes in the corner. But that completely hides the true nature of the country as a sprawling global empire. We're taught to think of the age of empires as ancient history, like, the British, the French, the Dutch. But the reality? The maps we use today are just minimizing the actual, literal extent of American power.
Just to put this into perspective, back in the 1940s, a staggering 19 million people lived in US territories outside the states. 19 million! That means if you lived under US jurisdiction back then, there was a 1 in 8 chance you didn't even live on the mainland. You just couldn't escape daily life under the empire. People were forced to salute the flag, they had to use American dollars, but here's the ticker: they often didn't even have the same constitutional rights as folks living stateside.
So, let's look at part 1 of this explainer, the hidden territories.
To really get how this all went down, we have to look at how the whole project started as a settler colony. We've all heard of Manifest Destiny, right? Violently pushing west across North America, displacing native populations. But the thing is, it didn't just magically stop when they hit the Pacific. By 1941, this expansion swept up overseas holdings like Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And then World War II kicked this into massive overdrive, ending with these huge territorial occupations in places like Germany, Korea, Japan, and Austria. And the numbers here are just wild. By the end of 1945, there were 135 million people living under American rule outside the mainland. Let that sink in. At that exact moment in history, there were actually more people living under US control outside that traditional classroom map than within it. The United States held this completely unprecedented level of global leverage. They literally could have just annexed these territories forever. But they didn't. Which brings us to part 2, the global garrison.
So instead of formal annexation, the whole strategy shifted. The US basically realized, hey, we don't actually need to be a physical empire to reap all the benefits of one.
After formally letting some of its colonies go, the US completely pivoted and set up a global system of military bases. And get this, today the US operates roughly 800 foreign military bases. 800! Now compare that to the rest of the world's major powers. The UK and France, they have about 13 combined. Russia has 9. Seriously, 800 versus 13 and 9. There is absolutely no comparison.
To put some boots on the ground for those numbers, those 800 bases represent roughly 173,000 troops deployed across 159 different countries. In places like Japan, Germany, and South Korea, this footprint translates to around 100 foreign military installations per country. I mean, just take a second and imagine if a foreign power stationed 100 of their military bases all over your country, right next to your major cities and borders. It sounds crazy, but it's a reality that most of the world just has to live with as totally normal.
But what are all these bases actually doing out there? Well, they aren't just sitting around acting as peaceful embassies, that's for sure. They are permanent leverage points. We're talking housing nuclear weapons pointed outward. They act as launch pads for covert operations. Like back in the 1960s, the CIA literally used a base on Swan Island to blast disinformation across the Caribbean just to instigate a coup in Cuba. These bases ensure there are boots on the ground to protect American corporate interests, like foreign oil, and they serve as immediate staging grounds for rapid invasions. And this global web, it is incredibly active. By its own admission, since 1991, the US has launched over 250 military interventions. 250! And since 1982, there have been over 350 attempted coups. I mean, that is the literal definition of an active, highly aggressive global posture, just constantly operating around the clock.
Now, if you're sitting there thinking this just sounds like ancient Cold War history, well, check out this casual, on-air admission from former National Security Advisor John Bolton back in 2022. When he was asked about coup attempts, he just openly stated, and I quote, "As somebody who has helped plan coups, not here, but, other places, it takes a lot of work," end quote. I mean, wow. That is not exactly something you expect to hear casually dropped on television, but it really gives you a stark look into how foreign policy is actually conducted behind closed doors.
All right, moving on to part 3, the invisible economy.
Because you see, military might is only part of the equation here. Think of this next step like a corporate hostile takeover, but scaled up to the entire globe. Basically, why buy a whole country and deal with the massive headache of actually running it when you can just rewrite its financial rules? It works like this, through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, where, by the way, the US uniquely holds veto power. The strategy is super simple. First, offer conditional loans to developing nations. Next, demand that they drastically reduce their government spending and sell off public assets. And finally, allow American corporations completely frictionless entry so they can extract resources and utilize cheap labor.
And the results of this invisible economy absolutely speak for themselves. By 2012, American companies own 46% of all publicly listed shares of the top 500 corporations in the entire world. Just think about that for a second. A country that represents roughly 4% of the global population wields ownership over nearly half of the world's top corporate wealth. It is just an unrivaled, mind-boggling level of control over global resources.
Which brings us to the fourth and final part of this explainer, the weaponized dollar.
This is really the ultimate mechanism of control, the foundation holding this entire machine together. Back in 1971, the US ended the global gold standard, and the absolute monopoly of the American dollar began. Because essential lifeblood resources like oil are priced globally in dollars, almost every single central bank on Earth is basically forced to stockpile US currency. This means that nearly every country is deeply, inescapably embedded in American monetary policy. With a single keystroke tweaking interest rates, the US can dictate massive chunks of the entire global economy.
So what happens if a country steps out of line? Well, the US just deploys its ultimate non-military weapon, economic sanctions. Right now, as we speak, there are roughly 15,000 active US economic sanctions. 15,000! That figure breaks literally all historical records and is 3 times higher than the next closest country on Earth.
Now, I know sanctions might just sound like boring financial paperwork when you hear about them on the evening news, but their real-world impact absolutely rivals physical conflict. Today, US sanctions target a full third of all nations and severely impact 60% of the world's poorest countries. Being cut off from the dollar basically means being completely crippled. Take the 60-year embargo on Cuba, for example. In the government's own official words, the intent was to decrease real wages and bring about hunger and desperation to instigate a coup. It is a highly calculated system that forces millions into poverty just to maintain leverage.
So when you actually step back and put it all together,
the hidden territories, the 800 military bases, the invisible economic extraction, and the absolute weaponization of the global currency, you start to see a map that looks entirely different. It's an empire, plain and simple. But history teaches us one undeniable rule. Every empire, without exception, eventually falls. So, with its reach stretched this far and its control this absolute, it leaves us with one lingering question. Is this one next?